Hey guys, what is up and welcome back to the channel. In this episode of Epic Emulation Updates, we're going to be taking a look at some brand new updates for some of the most highly requested games you guys have asked for on the channel. We're especially going to be looking at PlayStation 3 emulation, Wii U emulation, and even more updates for some of your favorite Nintendo Switch emulators. Before we get started, if you want to help with the development of any of these emulators we're about to look at, you can, as always, find links to each of their respective Patreon funds down in the description of this video. So please, if you want to help with their development in any small way, please head on over to any of those links and show your support for all of these guys' absolutely awesome work. Now that all that's out of the way, let's get started with the video where first of all we're going to be taking a look at Nintendo Switch emulation. And yes, once again we are taking another look at Ryujinx, the Nintendo Switch emulator, where once again we have gotten another update for compatibility in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. You may have previously seen on the channel that this emulator was indeed booting Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, but once you progressed into the stage selection or character selection screen, it would simply crash and proceed no further. Thanks to a brand new update to the master branch of Ryujinx emulator, it is now able to progress not only into the character selection screen, but is also able to load into gameplay. Now, I really must tell you guys that the footage you're seeing right now, while yes, it was locally recorded on my system, and the frame rates you are seeing in the top window are indeed the frame rates you would yourself be seeing in game, most of this footage, especially so in the transitional areas, are heavily edited, mostly due to the fact that loading screens can take up to 10 to 15 minutes in my experience. Regardless of loading times and how good or how bad this emulator is, once you do load into most of these screens, they are for one rendered very well, and performance wise they are generally pretty good also. Now, the rendering is also pretty RNG in the fact that sometimes it can be really poor. It has this very weird rendering bug where sometimes a previous frame of the video will just constantly flicker on screen, and while I did find that turning off the game VSync in the config file for Ryujinx did tend to help this, it didn't stop it altogether and you're going to see some flashing in the gameplay. Going back to the previous mentioned loading times, this screen right here after character selection probably took me about 25 or 30 minutes alone, which was pretty crazy. The gameplay footage you're watching right now is sped up about 4000%, and from time to time I just thought that the emulator was going to crash at any moment, but after some perseverance you can see that I did indeed get loaded into gameplay, and while obviously it is not rendered in any way correctly at all, it's still really nice to see any kind of progress in the emulation of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. This is pretty much as far as I could get in respect to any kind of gameplay, simply due to the fact that once it got to this stage of emulation, it would pretty much just freeze or crash outright. And I know you guys are probably also going to be asking, is this game bootable or in any way playable on Yuzu emulator? And unfortunately the answer to that question, at least right now, is no. Let's move swiftly along and take a look at Cemu, an emulator for the Wii U. So, have you ever found yourself spending way too much time playing Breath of the Wild on Cemu emulator? Have you ever found yourself losing a track of time and playing the game for too long? If the answer to either of those questions is yes, we now have a solution to this problem thanks to modder Melon Speedruns. He has created a brand new modification that's going to allow you to synchronize both your in-game time and in-game weather pattern with exactly the same kind of weather and time depending on your actual real-world location. The mod itself is pretty simple to use. All you need to do is follow all the instructions you see on screen. Do be aware that you're going to need to use Breath of the Wild update version 1.5.0 in order to have this synchronization application fully work. I would also advise running it as administrator, but other than that it works absolutely flawlessly. You can find a download for this mod down in the description of this video right now. With this mod's utilization, you will never have to worry about losing a track of time in Breath of the Wild ever again. Let's move quickly along once again and take a look at yet another massive update, this time from RPCS3, an emulator for the PlayStation 3 platform. This emulator has seen yet another absolutely huge update that boosts not only game compatibility but also massively boosts many games' performance. One such game that is very demanding on this emulator can be seen right now, God of War 3. This title's stability and performance has drastically increased in the last 2 to 3 weeks, moving from around 14 to 15 frames per second in this exact scene, well above 30 in almost all circumstances when not recording gameplay. Not only has performance improved in God of War 3, but it has also improved in pretty much every single game that supports SPU LLVM. Many games have recently been updated in compatibility to support this new SPU decoder. You can find the option itself right here in the CPU tab settings of RPCS3. Many games which previously supported this SPU decoder but also required accurate exfloat to be activated no longer need this accurate exfloat option to be enabled, and as a result they have greatly grown in performance levels. If you are using any games and are struggling for performance, I would highly advise testing out this brand new experimental mode. Thanks to not only optimizations with this exfloat setting, but also to the LLVM recompiler itself, many games such as Persona 5 and indeed, as you're seeing right now, God of War 3 have gotten even better performance and indeed stability on the emulator. In relation to God of War 3's compatibility and indeed performance, I would still have to say that it's not quite yet there, and when you consider that this gameplay you're watching right now is being run on an i7-8700K clocked at 4.9 GHz, not everyone is obviously going to have access to that kind of raw power in their CPU, and while obviously performance optimizations and performance improvements are very welcome, at least in relation to God of War 3, it's going to take quite a lot longer to get this game running in a stable and at playable frame rate levels on lower end hardware. Let's keep the video going and moving on to even more awesome news in this emulator. Ni no Kuni Wrath of the White Witch is now fully playable from start to finish, even on much lower end or mid-tiered computer hardware. This is definitely one of the most requested games for me to cover on the channel, especially so since it is a PS3 exclusive and has since seen a sequel released on both the PS4, Xbox One and PC platforms. Having played the game myself now for about 7 or 8 hours, I really couldn't recommend this game enough. It is such an awesome game, and even on my mid-tiered system containing an i5 4690K, 16GB of RAM and a GTX 680, I was able to run it absolutely no problem without any hiccups. If you've never played the game or never heard of this series, I would highly advise picking up a copy of this game and dumping it so you can play it on your PC. It really is such an absolutely stunning game, both in gameplay aspects and in art form. If there was a game I could compare it to, or a series indeed, I would probably mostly compare it to the Tales series. So if you've played games like Tales of Symphonia or Tales of Vesperia, you're going to have a fairly awesome time and a very enjoyable one when playing this game. All of the gameplay footage you've seen so far was captured using my previously mentioned mid-tiered CPU, and as you may have noticed, I basically didn't drop below the frame cap of 30 frames per second in this game at any point in time in gameplay. Moving swiftly along, let's take a look at yet another advancement in relation to emulation on RPCS3. And no, your eyes are not deceiving you. Thanks to all of the compatibility and performance improvements to this emulator, Skate 3 is now considered fully playable at good performance levels on this emulator. They have also fixed several issues in relation to graphical rendering and instability, basically making this game completely playable from start to finish. You may notice in the gameplay that there are some issues, especially in relation to how some shadows are rendered. If you're not aware of it, a few updates ago, probably about a month ago I would say right now, they gave us another update for this game that fixed many of the rendered shadows, for example the dynamic one you're seeing on our character model, but there are still some issues with shadow rendering, and from time to time you'll see these shadows kind of spaz out, especially so on cars and on certain geometry in the environment. Having played the game for about 6 or 7 hours now at this point, even though my skateboarding skills haven't really improved too much, the game is very playable and at very good performance levels. Do however bear in mind that this was once again run on my 8700K clocked at 4.9 GHz, so performance levels may vary depending on your CPU. If you have any questions in relation to any of the settings required to run any of these games at optimal frame rates and visual fidelity levels, do not be afraid to leave a comment down below, or alternatively, if you want to, join my Discord and I will help you in any way I possibly can over there. As I already said guys, if you want to help with the development of any of these emulators, please head on over to any of their respective Patreons and pledge your donation. There really isn't any amount that is too small for a donation, and every little bit helps. Once again guys, cheers for checking out this video. Remember to like it if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't, and as always, subscribe to the channel if you want to see all future videos from me.